My name is Tricia Rose, and I'm a faculty member here at Brown in Africana Studies. I work in African American culture, history, and social issues. And I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. And we have decided to offer this conversation today as part of our sort of family of learners, alumni, parents, and students. And it's a 50-minute conversation for those of you who sort of stumbled in and didn't maybe see the entire guide. And the goal here is I'll have a conversation with Dr. Sullivan, and then we'll have a conversation with you. And then there's a reception at CSREA, which is at 96 Waterman Street. It's one parallel street over from Angel, where we are. And there'll be a sandwich board out front, so you'll be able to sort of figure it out. And we have treats and snacks, as well as actually copies of this pretty amazing book we're going to talk about. So just for 2 minutes, or maybe 1 minute, I just want to share what our mission at CSREA is all about. You can see a much more detailed description on the website, but our goal here is to feature and support excellent and relevant scholarship on issues of race and ethnicity in America. We build community within the university among graduate students and faculty and some advanced undergraduates, but we also invite speakers in on key issues and topics such as today. So one of the ways we really try to make a difference is to connect ideas to community. You know, there's so much amazing knowledge in academic circles, and a lot of it is much too complicated for us to have just a general public conversation about, like, applied math or something. But if you're talking about issues that shape every moment that we're consciously constructing, and it's still in English, it's not in math talk, we want that space to be really connected. We want great ideas to be connected to community. So we seek out people who are able to take very complicated conceptual, theoretical issues and break them down in ways that we understand, so that we can talk across disciplines, so we can talk to our communities, we can talk to our alum, to our students, and to family members. And as part of the broader campaign focus on making, the world more peaceful and just, you can't study race and ethnicity in the United States, particularly groups that have been aggrieved and colonized and discriminated against, and not try to think about it in relationship to creating a just world. We have lots of events. I just want to say this before we transition into the ideas, that out front where you came in here, there's a sign-up sheet to be on our mailing list. Even if you're not near Providence, really, I recommend you sign up. We put a lot of what we do, almost all of what we do, online, and we notify people when it is online, so you can be in Seattle with your terrific cup of fresh brewed coffee, and you can watch any number of things that we've done, not only recently, but in the past, and it's a fantastic archive. So please sign up. So this topic today, when Dr. Sullivan and I decided to do this, it wasn't it was relevant, but it got increasingly relevant as things unfolded. It also became more difficult and complicated. So it is, we acknowledge, a difficult time to think and reflect on race in America. It's especially difficult, but also especially important to think about whiteness. Most of our conversations about race and ethnicity speak to the moment that's not white, to the community that is itself not marked by whiteness, and whiteness becomes a category of social identity and political and cultural and intergenerational practice that goes unmarked. And there's this tremendous difficulty with that kind of unmarking. Figuring out what role does whiteness play, how does it work, is unbelievably important in our conversations on race and ethnicity. But even more importantly, and this is the focus of our conversation and the focus of this fantastic book, is that there's an assumption that whiteness should be talked about only when it's basically bad whiteness, when it's whiteness that's doing intentional harm based on race. But what about the sort of Achilles heels of good whiteness, of good people? This is the thesis for the book, and how good intentions don't necessarily take us where we want to go. So our guest scholar, as I mentioned, is Professor Shannon Sullivan. She's chair of philosophy and health psychology at UNC Charlotte. She's a feminist philosopher, critical philosopher of race, and American philosophy. She's authored 4 books. The latest one is the subject of our conversation today, Good White People, The Problem of Middle Class Anti-Racism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shannon Sullivan. everyone. That was quick. There's nothing to talk about. You know how it is. Okay, so how is this? We have wheels. I guess we could roll up. That might be more efficient.
Can y'all hear us in the back?
Oh, yeah, I can hear now. Okay, I can hear you. Okay, are we all set? I'm going to give it 1 minute for these last settlers. Thank you so much for coming. So, Shannon, I'll call you Shannon. Make it more conversational. Oh, that was quick. Okay.
Yes.
All right, how are we doing? Okay, I'm just going to stay very still, which, for those of you who might have been in my classes, you know this is absolutely impossible, but I'm going to do my best. Thank you for coming to Brown. It's been great. Yesterday's conversation was fantastic. I love this book, and I want to talk about it with you here, but I want to give you a chance to sort of lay out the argument for the audience. You know, I'm going to assume some people haven't read it, and just to give them a sense of what you're up to here.
So thank you for having me here, and thank you. What a wonderful full room this is. In a nutshell, I'm trying to argue that white people need to figure out some different ways to live their whiteness, a different ethos, a different way of being and living as a white person that's not centered on traditional liberal values of moral goodness. And even just to mark whiteness, as you were saying, is white people have ways of living their whiteness, but we usually don't think about it, we don't talk about it. We good white people don't anyway. And one of the things I'm very critical of is a way in which a kind of divide, a really strong divide between the so-called good white people and the bad ones gets set up. And the bad ones are the white supremacists. This is usually very much class marked in terms of poorer white folks who are uneducated, who don't know better, and they're the reason why white supremacy and racism in general continues in the United States today. They're the problem, not us good white people who are educated, who know better, etc. And that divide, I think, is pernicious, and a lot of what's going on that divide does very, very little to actually combat racial injustice. It's more about securing a position of moral goodness and moral superiority as one of the good white people. So I'm trying to kind of break down that divide and call for different ways for white people to live their whiteness.
Right, great. That's very helpful. So you identify 4 strands of liberal white anti-racism. So, you know, just to remind the audience, we're talking about liberal anti-racist practices, or what people think of as supporting an anti-racist identity and practice. And you identify 4 strands that you say are very common. Can you describe the 4 of them very quickly?
Yeah, and I refer to them in general as what I call distancing strategies. Mm-hmm. I think middle class white people, I use middle class really broadly here, as middle to upper class. Middle class white people like to distance themselves mm-hmm. from race and racism in general, and certainly whiteness. Right. And one of the ways to do that is to just not talk about it, to be very silent. Mm-hmm. Another way is to dump on the so-called bad white people. You know, they're the problem. That's where the racism is located. It's not us. We're the ones who want to fight it. So I talk about this in terms of dumping on white trash, which is a slur here, but that's why I'm air quoting. But methods of dumping on so-called white trash as the problem. There's also a way of demonizing white ancestors, white slaveholders, Klan members, just demonizing the white past. Think of Jim Crow era and before. Back then, they didn't know better. There was this awful racism and white supremacy in our nation. Now we know better. They were awful. We're not like them. The third one would be colorblindness, pretending to not see race at all. And we're all just people. I don't see race. And as long as I don't see race, then I know I'm not a racist. I can secure my identity as a good white person. And then the fourth one would be thinking that cultivating guilt and shame is sort of the appropriate way to be a good white person, and that is going to take care of any remaining racism in the world.
Right. You know, all of these I can think of very relevant examples of, but I was really struck by the way there was a natural tendency to assume that only, poor whites affected the election outcome, that there was just an assumption that everyone knew that mostly whites voted for our current president. That was not a surprise. But the class assumptions turned out to be entirely untrue.
To be wrong.
Did you find, have you thought about that in relationship to this dumping?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That statistics came out, and most of us probably know that across class lines, a lot of white people voted for Trump, and it was not just poor people. It was not just a disgruntled poor or working class, but people middle class, financially comfortable that were white voted for Trump as well.
Right.
I think in today's day post 2016 election, and I'm also thinking about incidents in Charlottesville, it is all the more tempting and all the more seductive to buy back into this dichotomy of the bad white people over here, and then there are the good ones over here, and we know that they're the problem. It's not us. Right. And this distancing or deflecting where and how races, and misunderstanding when and how some extremely pernicious forms of white domination still occur.
Right. And so even though, those 4 strategies are about sort of various modes of separating oneself from this bad either history or set of current ideas, there's still a real discomfort, as your own research and your citing of other research shows, around even talking about whiteness. Could you share with this audience that story of the study of the the one. Let's not waste time summarizing. You go for it.
Well, right. I mean, the minute as a white person you start talking about whiteness or start asking other white people, so how are you, what are you, and I'm especially interested in issues of parenting and child rearing. White people out there, how are you rearing your children, your grandchildren as white? Talk about fear and silence in response to that question. That's just not something you're supposed to talk about. That's not what good white people talk about. That sounds like something a Klan member, bad white person would say. So one of the, you just don't talk about that. One of the studies, this one took place in Austin, Texas, which is a very self-identified, very liberal sort of pocket of the United States and of Texas in particular. It was a recent study where 100 families were recruited to, they were white families with white children, to have parents talk with their children about race. One group had some vignettes, videotapes to do it with. One was supposed to do it without them, and the study was to see how effective the tapes were. And the families signed up knowing this is what the study was. It wasn't one of those social science studies where they kind of fake you out, where you think they're studying one thing and it's not another. It was up front. They knew what the study was. They volunteered. They wanted to do it. And the study failed. The author could not get any results out of it because 94 of the families refused in the end to do their assignment, knowing that this is what the assignment would be. And they just said in the end, and this is a quote here, we just don't want to have those conversations with our child. We don't want to point out skin color. And, this is just not what white families do. And so, on one hand, the study failed, but on another hand, it was very revealing about it's not even at a conscious level, this full-bodied just discomfort and inability sometimes to have conversations with race, about whiteness.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I think it would be great to see a follow-up study with those same people reflecting on their own investment. So that's the tension that your work is really revealing. This isn't about hate or refusal, neither one of those. It's about we've really cultivated a complete lack of language and capacity to see, and we've cultivated such discomfort, which leads me to one of the amazing chapters on colorblindness and parenting. When we think about colorblindness and sort of racial social practices, we usually think about adults and sort of fully formed beings. But the question of how we reproduce, how do we create these ways of thinking, and some people have written on this, a certain number of African American scholars have, but I loved your sort of discussion of this formation. So can you just share a little bit more about colorblindness and parenting and how you work that argument out in the book?
So I've come to think of colorblindness, again, alleged colorblindness. I don't see race, just see people, as the white middle-class parenting strategy. Now, white parents don't usually say that. In fact, they usually don't talk about it at all. You might think about all sorts of questions when you have a child, and even questions about gender. You know, how am I going to raise a girl? Sorry, you usually don't say white. Just how am I going to raise a girl? How am I going to raise a boy? Even if I just inject white there, it's probably making you nervous. Like, why does she keep saying that?
Yeah.
Is she really secretly one of those bad white people? Because once you start troubling that line between the good and the bad, but I insist on that, and it's uncomfortable for me, and I know it's risky for me, and I know it's risky for you to hear that, but whiteness goes unmarked, as you were saying. But it's there, and you know, when I work with college students and teach college students, and I teach race and other things, and they don't just pop into being at 18 years old and somehow find out about race. They've been learning all about race and how to live, if they're white, how to live as a white person. They've been picking this up all along, but it usually happens in these unspoken ways.
Right.
And so all kinds of stuff is humming along there without examination and attention that's needed.
Tell them the story. I know, I'm sorry. It's like, tell them on page 38. Like a weird guide to your work. But that amazing story about the child who blurts out some completely non-good white person statement, and the parents couldn't figure out where she got it from, but it had to do with their route to the coffee shop or something, and how they avoided the gentleman on the street.
Oh, yeah. This one actually took place, I believe it was in New York. So it was a mother.
A very good white person.
A very good white person, and she's got a young child in the stroller or whatever. As they're, I think this is where she goes around the person, I think who was asking, it was a homeless man, a black man, asking for money, and she steers around, and etc. And her child blurts out.
Over and over.
Like this happens multiple times.
Right, so she just picks another route.
Route, goes around. And I forgot the exact thing. The child's like 3 or maybe 3. The child it's at like a dinner party. They've had other families over. The other families are white. And and out of the blue, the child blurts out something like, "Black men are scary and dangerous." That was about correct. The quote.
At 3.
And the mother's horrified. And it's like, nervously trying to reassure, well, how did you pick that up? And kind of reassuring, that's not something we talk about here at home. And the child had been taught over and again, particularly when it came to electric outlets in the wall, to stay away from dangerous things, avoid dangerous things. We avoid those because they're dangerous. And so the child learned that, and then again and again saw this pattern of going around avoiding. And it's like, oh, so now I'm learning this is another dangerous thing that I need to avoid. And so proudly announced the thing that he had learned and chose the moment of the dinner party to do that. And the white husband and wife, they were just mortified. But talk about very early at 3 or 4, and there's a lot of other of information from sociologists and child development specialists where kids are picking up all sorts of messages about race, about whiteness, they wouldn't call it power relations, but all these dynamics, and they're trying to figure out how to process this. And for white kids, and this is different in white families than many families of color, with very little space, a safe space in their family to ask what's going on, they usually just get shushed. The white child blurts something out in the grocery store, and the white mother just shushes kind of in an embarrassed way to make sure that nothing awkward happened. Mm-hmm. And so these are some of the ways in which whiteness is being built up, white habits are being built up in childhood.
Right. And one of the other strategies for keeping that silence is the guilt and shaming, where any number of people can do it, but it's particularly effective when good whites shame, quote unquote, fallen good whites, because they don't usually have to shame, quote unquote, white supremacists. That's not going to be terribly effective. But shaming other fallen, mistaken good whites becomes this other mode of silence production and makes it much harder to have these very conversations. Can you talk a little bit more about this guilt and shaming, because it does really get at the binaries we're dealing with, right? The silence and the shaming as working together.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, there is a lot in American and global history to feel ashamed about. And so I'm not saying that shame is never appropriate, but I worry about I worry about using that as like a primary emotional or affective relationship to thinking about race and racism. I don't think it has the staying power to get white people to dig in and commit to doing some of this work. Because this is going to be long, hard. It has been for hundreds of years. There's a pessimistic note in a lot of the things I write. I don't think a lot of this is going to quickly change anytime soon. So it's going to be a long haul and a lot of work. And I don't think shaming and sort of self-flagellation is going to be a long-term strategy for getting white people to invest into really caring about racial justice. Yeah. And I have seen in my classrooms, for example, a white student who says something, frankly, that's racially offensive. It was part of an honest question, but it was racially offensive. And another white student jump up and just shame that person, back into place. And that being a really counterproductive way to have some conversations about what's going on.
Yeah, and it's complicated too in my own teaching in classrooms where it's a fairly diverse environment and different groups of people can do the shaming, right? But the end result is that it's very hard to have certain kinds of conversations. So it seems that, one of the things you're calling for is it's neither silence nor sort of forced blame and shame, but some sort of third way, as it were. Can you sort of describe not so much the actions, but the sort of how would it have gone if the student who was doing the shaming in the story you just told didn't do the shaming? But some kind of challenge is obviously necessary. You can't, otherwise that becomes silence, which we already know the work that's doing. So what are some options that this other student had, the responding student, that you would have been, you think would be more productive?
Yeah, it's a hard question. So, one part of the answer is I think it's very hard to do that in large public spaces where you don't know each other well. And this was the one incident I'm thinking of is a classroom about this size with 150 people. So the shaming was pretty brutal doing this in front of these other students, because I think it's going to have to be more in smaller spaces where there could be a real conversation. It's hard to be called out as a racist or as saying, feeling, thinking, doing something if you're a white person and someone points out, I can't believe that. That's a really racist thing you just said. The immediate mode most white people, myself included, would want to go to is very defensive. So this has got to be a space which I think is smaller and in some kind of relationship to have more of a conversation.
Right. But, and so to play devil's advocate a little bit, just to think this through from multiple angles, at the same time, there is resistance even when it's not about shaming. So, as a teacher, I see that, even when it's like, hey, look, all ideas are perfectly good to have, but they have to be thought through and you have to be willing to interrogate them. And I want to ask you some questions about this set of ideas. But, there's been a lot of resistance. Whenever a sort of anti-racist, sort of how structural racism happens, videos are presented in different settings. There's a lot of parental, particularly in high schools, and where parents are more directly involved in the curriculum, a lot of resistance that they feel just the fact of talking about significant structural racism is itself shaming. Yeah. Right? It's because if the mode of identity is silence, then talking about it and saying that there are outcomes that are bent to create tremendous advantages for whites across class, but differentially across class, is somehow itself shaming. So do you see what I mean? That maybe there's that tension or that gap is much harder to shoot, because it seems that just doing it at all, you end up doing so much caretaking that you never get to the work of saying, well, we're trying to unseat this thing, not make everyone feel good today.
And that caretaking point's really important. The work that goes in, there is an author, Robin DiAngelo, who's called this white fragility. The fragility that most white people have around issues of race and especially whiteness, it's like the person might just shatter if there's any sort of thing that feels like a challenge, even though it may not be direct at all, but just talking about structural racism, like what? I didn't get where I am because of the hard work that I did.
Right, it's not all or nothing, just for those of you who are like, yeah, that's a good question. Everyone works hard. Some people get more for their hard work. It's not, that's,
Yeah.
well, maybe not everyone, but in every group, but most of us.
So I've talked about it as a kind of so frankly it's a very hard question to answer about what would it mean for that third way. A lot of what I'm calling for in this work is for white people, and you're going to feel like for white people to dig in and do some of this work of figuring out some other way to live your whiteness, our whiteness. There's got to be more options than the bad white person and the good white person, where it turns out we just have different forms of violence against people of color, frankly. Now that sounds like a strong word. There's some very spectacular, there's very spectacular violence like Dylan Roof in South Carolina, and we can think about Charlottesville, but there are peaceful forms of violence that come through the structural racism that good white people certainly benefit from. Yeah, and perpetuate.
And in fact, in thinking about Charlottesville in particular, we talked a bit about, yesterday about how that kind of extreme hate unifies us around goodness, right? Mm-hmm. Around what good whiteness looks like, which is at least not that. And, I have to say there are moments when I'm like, I think I'll take good white people over that. Even with all the failings, I'm like, could the good white people come over here now? So we're all clear. But there was a fantastic story you wanted to tell about a farmer.
Yeah, there's
in town. So tell them. I'm sorry,
and you later can go Google this yourself. His name is Chris Newman. He is a black farmer that lives in Charlottesville. And after I don't read his blog regularly, but I ran across it after some of the incidents. There have been multiple protests in Charlottesville around taking down the Robert E. Lee statue, and then of course the second event was the one in August that had. That was more violent, and one person was killed. So Chris Newman, though, posted, he's a black farmer, and he talked about farming while black in Charlottesville, and he has actually stopped going. So he delivers, organic products and whatever. He's delivering them to very comfortable neighborhoods there in Charlottesville, or predominantly white neighborhoods. He's actually stopped making deliveries there because of how many times the cops get called because there's a black man in the neighborhood. And the way he put it was...
In a produce truck.
In a produce truck, like getting out the arugula and whatever, and the cop kind of is swinging by, checking him out, and this happened again and again, and so he's no longer delivering there, and he said, you know what, it's not Richard Spencer or the white boys with tiki torches who are calling the cops on me week after week. They are, he says, a visual inconvenience, and he was referring to some of the pictures of the tiki torches and the Confederate flags and everything there at in Charlottesville. He's like, this is what's going to leave my daughters fatherless. What's going to leave them fatherless is the yoga pants women, white women in yoga pants with "I'm with her" and "coexist" stickers on the back of her SUV. They're the ones who are scared of me, and if they, don't know why I'm there, they're calling the police. They're the biggest threat that I've got right here in Charlottesville. He goes on to talk about the way in which their black businesses like his have the cops called on them, while white businesses that sell hip-hop material and make tons of money on that, have no problems and are making a fortune. So he's talking about a lot of structural things that are going on in Charlottesville, and Charlottesville's not unique in that respect. But that, it's not the white supremacists that scare him, even when they're right there in his town with the torches having the marches. It's these other more peaceful forms of violence that scare him about, is something going to go wrong? Like I'm reaching in to get my lettuce and they think I'm reaching for something else and the cops have been called. That's what makes me scared for my daughters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, the lack of sort of true conversation about this fear of black people, right, that drives so much of this seemingly liberal, neutral behavior, I think, is underlying both the guilt and shame strategy, right, and the denials of it all the way around. But let me again push back a little bit from the other side and say, okay,
from a liberal perspective, this is kind of a high alert emergency historical moment, right? If you're a liberal and you didn't vote for Donald Trump, which you don't have to be a liberal to not vote for him, but just assume for the sake of argument, not that many liberals did. And they sort of feel that so many liberal values and institutions are on their way, under the wheels of a fast-moving truck. What would you say to anti-racist white liberals who may very well have the problems that you identify, but they might say, Shannon, it's DEFCON 1 right now, okay? We have real serious situations going on. We have white supremacists. We have white supremacist advocates in the White House as advisors. We have the support of, there are good people, which is a fascinating reuse of your, the good white people, right, in Charlottesville. But if they say we have to fight white supremacists and hate groups, it's not a time to criticize our approach, right? We're doing the best we can, supporting whatever we're supporting or behaving whatever, colorblindness is the best we can do. Or what would you say, how would you explain that's either true or not true, and what advice would you give them?
So I want to, it's a great question. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that somehow in criticizing what I'm calling the good white people, that white supremacists are blameless. There's horrific forms of violence there. That is true. The problem is it's not just a bunch of saints on the other side. It's a different form of violence, and I want to use that word, and I'm trying not to be hyperbolic about it, but it is. So it is the non-white supremacists that, particularly in my state, but this is happening in other states, that are radically rolling back the Voting Rights Act and all sorts of difficulties for poor and especially black people to just get to the polls and vote. This isn't Richard Spencer and people with tiki torches doing this. This is legislatures. These are the solid, some good white people who would count as good white people. It's one thing that we know since the end of Jim Crow, some of the measures of inequality between white people and other people of color have actually grown, especially since the 80s. When you look at disparities in wealth, and you know this, I know.
Yeah.
And when you look at disparities in health, which is another really interesting one, and when you look at incarceration rates, and a lot of this is set up and done through very, very legal channels. And so it's not to say that it's good that there are white supremacists like Dylan Roof walking into churches and killing people. That's an awful thing, and we need to find ways to stop that. But there is a danger in focusing on that, right, as if that is as if things like that are the main way that people of color get killed, get hurt, have their lives shortened. And it's spectacular. It certainly catches our eyes, and I do want to emphasize it's awful. It needs to be stopped. But percentage-wise, there is a lot more harm being done in less spectacular ways. Yeah. So I am calling out the hubris of middle-class white people and thinking we know how to fix this. I don't think we really know, and that's not a comfortable place to be in. To just feel like you've had, sorry, this is like a Zen koan. You just like sorry, I could go there later if you want me to. It's like having sand thrown in your eyes and just stop short, and everything you thought was the right way to do it, that we learned through all this stuff. And I'm not about rolling back civil rights accomplishments, but we thought we knew all these things were going to fix things, and all of these measurements are actually worse now. So we don't know how to fix this. And so just having more good white folks kind of doing the same old thing, we've got to at least stop and go, we've got to have some other options. Yeah. And I think, we talked about this yesterday. It's not directly in the book, but it flows from it. The level of resistance to the things that could fix it, that it isn't just we don't know, I think you're saying. It's a willful refusal to really address reality. So part of, studies since the 80s have shown that, well over 60-70% of whites think racial equality has already been achieved. And then another 20 think it's right on the way. Right there. So that's 80%. The numbers are, the reality is so dramatically different.
that it raises the question how a person could have, so that venue, hey, it's already equal, changes the interpretive framework for demands for talking about race and racism. It looks like extra and frustrating, and why don't you leave us alone? You already ate, we've done all we can do.
We did that in the 60s.
We did that, right.
Yeah. And your point about all these statistics we're referring to, they're out there, they're easy to find, you can Google them, books talk about, there's something else going on. You think there's kind of willful not knowing, or a willful ignorance or something, because all this data is out there, and yet that does not seem to make much difference to a large majority of white people. There is another motivation, there is something else at work. It is not just going to be making sure that white people know the real statistics about inequalities in health and wealth and other things we're talking about. There's something else going on.
Yeah, for sure. So there's always the what can we do question. If you study these issues, there's a drive to say, what can we do? How can we fix this? And, on the one hand, we don't want to be so cerebral. We'll say, well, there's really nothing you can do. Just reflect on it, meditate, So we don't want to go that route. On the other hand.
Because that sounds like another stalling
I
distancing technique,
can do
too.
that while I'm silent.
Yeah, right.
Too,
I'm not being silent, I'm just reflecting.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, does anyone have anything to say? You're like, not yet, not yet. But at the same time, the other strategy you identify as sort of a kind of knee-jerk, what can I do to fix this because I can't stand the discomfort that has been generated, so we want to fix this, and what's my top 5 steps, and let me do them right now, as if we could do it in 5 steps all together today. And so you're struggling with this tension, but you end on something that is, both super engaging to me, but also a little scary, which is, more examination and self-love among white people. So, not to say we shouldn't have as much self-love as possible, but an argument, could be made. There's just a whole lot of self-love going on. It may not be
a lot of white self-love already.
It may not be the self-love that, helps racial justice, but it does kind of feel like a whole lot of love of whiteness. So how do you call for more of it? What kind are you calling for? So,
and you're right. The end of the book is the most controversial part of the book.
Yeah. First time I read it, I skipped it. Then I was like, I gotta go. It's called The Struggle with Love. I'm like, I better struggle.
Well, and you don't have to buy the book. You can check it out from the library or something. But please know I spend 2 whole chapters. This is not a quick thing I throw out there. It is a critical form of love. But, and also I should say, in some ways I feel like I need to make sure I'm giving credit to people like Stokely Carmichael in the Black Power book from the 1960s. I feel like I'm, in some ways, it's also weird that now Baldwin. If a white person says it gets attention. Yeah. But he talks, and there's a chapter in that book. That is a great book to go back and pick up again if you haven't read it, or go reread it. There's this chapter in there in the middle about solidarity or working together as black and white people on issues of racial justice. And one of the things he says is, kind of paraphrasing, why are white people here? Why do you want to do this? If this is just charity or helping black people, go away. We don't need that. So white people have got to figure out and you'll say this, a good working relationship, each side knows why they're there and what's in it for them. Ooh, and that sounds selfish. That sounds bad. What do you mean, for a white person? But why? Why white people? Why do you want to do this work? And maybe the honest answer is you don't. I don't know. If you'll have to figure that answer out. But there has to be some kind of, if love isn't the right word, some kind of investment that's not about a charitable helping others, right, but that this has something to do that is gripping and matters to you and your life and your world and your family. Mm-hmm. And that's going to provide some kind of affective, I use words like I talk about a kind of soul work. I don't mean in a religious sense, but some sense of kind of a work on who it is and what you are as a white person. And if it's just a bunch of virtue signaling, people of color don't need that. So why do you care about this? Why do you do it? Right. We white people have got to figure out some kind of answer to that question. Yeah. And I think it has to be formed out of that answer's got to come out of some kind of care for the self. not self-flagellation.
Right. Very nice. Thank you. So I want to make sure we have time for some questions. Do we have microphones for this? No? So that means, can we ask them, Paul? Can we? Yeah. I mean, we don't need to have. Oh, is there? Okay,
Oh,
great. Sam, could you? Can you help us out,
If
Sam?
it's not
with that?
corded, we
Thank
could,
you. I guess is there? Oh, unless you guys, are there people in the? Oh, we have people. I can't see very well. Sorry. So
Yeah. Oh,
I
good.
don't
Okay,
know
that's great.
what's going on. Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. If we want to make a change, we really must involve our children, and not our college students. I'm talking about preschool and grade school. The only way we're going to make a change is to be on that level and grow it up from there. So I go back and say, well, you mentioned colorblindness. I thought that was a good thing. I really did.
No,
you keep culture.
Yeah.
You identify culture and color. You're colorblind, but you can still appreciate people's culture. What do we tell the families? Because I believe there are many, many, many families that believe they're doing the right thing by telling their children or just behaving as though you are colorblind. They live and breathe. People live and breathe. We're the same. So what do we tell those families that want to do the right thing? And that, I mean, I hate to say that colorblindness you're saying is not the right thing.
I'm increasingly convinced it's not, and that it is. But I'm not disagreeing with you about the good intentions. That there's a hope that would do it. And also I think there is a real sense of if a set of white parents or white family was thinking about it, there just seemed to be no other options. So golly, you got to hang on to this. It seems like something at least. Because what does it mean to start talking as a white parent with your white child about their whiteness and race? So first of all, most parents don't feel at all qualified or capable or comfortable doing that. How do I do that? If I can't even figure out for myself as an adult to how to be comfortable thinking about race, how do I explain to one example is I can give you examples of trying to, when my daughter was 4 years old, she's white, and we used to have this little ritual at the end of the day where we talk about things we did during the day. So she told me about, what preschool was like that day, and then she asked me, and I was like, well, I was working on this chapter that had to do with whiteness and race. And so then she starts asking, well, what is race? And so then, already I'm in how do you spell, I can explain that to other academics, with my long paragraph, whatever. How do you to a 4-year-old explain it in a way that doesn't make it just seem natural or some. So I kind of mentioned something because I thought they had done something in preschool where they learned a little bit about slavery. Turns out I had misunderstood that. There was an MLK Day or something, and there was no mention of any kind of power imbalances or none of. Because how do you start talking about power imbalances? How do you start talking about serious, deep trauma in this nation? And do that with a 4 or 5-year-old in a way that's not lying, but that isn't re-traumatizing. Or do you re-traumatize? I don't know.
Right.
But I also, this was one of my moments where I thought, so she starts asking me, so I say something, I can recreate it if you want, it's in the book. I finally come up with something to say, and she asks, are we white? And I said, yes, we're white. She's like, okay. She goes, do we own slaves? No, because I'd mentioned slavery. So I was like, you can hear the inner panic in my mind. Am I just now making things worse? Maybe it's better if I just shut up and go colorblind. We're all just people. So how do you instill this sense of respect, but that you're acknowledging there are different ways that we get treated and treat each other in this world today, and they are picking up on that and seeing it and not understanding it and trying to process it. So it really misrepresents the world we live in today to just talk about an ideal world where we're all equal and race doesn't matter. Maybe that's what we're all shooting for. It might be. Right. But that doesn't help them deal with this very non-ideal world we have right now and how to deal with that and do that in a way that challenges the injustice. There's no way to challenge it. If you can't see race, then how can you see racism?
Right. Let me add one thing, and then we have a question here, and I saw one down here as well. But, I think, part of the struggle is to figure out, and this is why this book is so powerful to me, is, exactly how does the invisibility of whiteness work to promote racial inequality?
Yeah, that's really nice.
Right. how does the invisibility of whiteness work to promote this racial hierarchy and disadvantage in the present? You can answer that partly with the past, but it works in the present on its own. And I think anti-racist education, assuming that not talking about race is anti-racism, is the first big mistake of colorblindness. It's not just cultural difference, right? It's about structures of relate. It's like feminism. Adding women to history without an analysis of gender discrimination and hierarchy is not a feminist analysis. It's not going to explain how we got here. So I think getting schools, I mean, if I had, friends who had little children who were white, most of my friends have children who are a little bit older than that, I would say, don't let your school off the hook. A lot of parents pressure schools to not talk about race.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And they go crazy. Private schools can't, are not, public schools have a whole nother set to do with this. But saying, well, I want my kids to be literate around what egalitarianism will look like in a multiracial democracy, right? That's, I think, one of the ways we can make a big difference.
And teachers this is tricky for teachers too.
Right,
and
especially if they don't have the support.
Yeah.
Of
and you've got
parents
parents maybe saying very different things
Right.
about what they want.
Right.
So how do you do that? And so most of the way it gets done is through a kind of, maybe you learn a little bit about Martin Luther King, and usually you learn about the different foods and dresses and practices of the different cultures, right? And so then it just turns into a kind of smorgasbord of stuff for white. Like, well, that's interesting. I like Mexican food, and I like, soul food. And it turns into this lovely way that you just get to, it's just lovely for white people. And there's no mention, but it's hard. I don't want to be flippant. This is hard. Every time I talk about this stuff, people who are in child development specialties, and there needs to be so much work, especially at these younger levels, like you were pointing out. How do you talk to a 4-year-old about this? Because they're already picking some of this stuff up. They don't know how to process it. And that's probably going to look different than the way you're going to talk to a 12-year-old about it. And that's going to look different from, and I mean, that here is whiteness and the power imbalances that you're talking about. We've got so much work there to do to figure that out.
Right, for sure.
Question, yes. I'm a little bit confused as to who are the good white people, because if there could be a lecture at Liberty University, for example, Farwell's University in Lynchburg, Virginia, and you can have two people talking about that they're the good white people. And completely disagree with you regarding the liberal sort of aspect of things, and they're the conservative, and they represent the good white people, and they represent the better values and the Christian values, if you will, of why they are good white people. And indeed, I don't see those two groups talking to each other.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very helpful question. Maybe I should, when I use the word liberal, I mean in the sense of that classic liberal sense of there's supposedly the liberal values of equality and freedom at the cornerstones of our nation. So I don't mean Democrat versus Republican. And I know many people in Charlotte who are white Christian Republicans who very much would identify themselves. Well, they don't identify themselves as good white people because most people don't identify themselves openly as white. Like, that's already kind of a strange thing, the way I keep doing that. But yeah, there's some of the good ones. They're not racist. They just want a good education for their child. They just want to live in a good neighborhood. They just want to support, So you're very much right about that. I think...
Oh, no, I think many of them are racist. Wait a second.
Yeah, well, they are... They are, but they don't... I would agree with you that they are, but they don't... They would say, look, I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not a Klan member. I think that's awful. I think it's awful that Dylan Roof went into a church of all things, and sat in Sunday school for an hour with these folk and then killed them. They will completely agree that's awful, and that's awful, and I'm not them, and that's racism, and I'm not that. Yeah. But behind the desire to live in the school district that will educate the kids well, I want to be in a good neighborhood. This is racially coded throughout in ways that you're nodding, I'm sure you're aware of.
Yeah, I think there's been an I'm going to talk till the mic gets where it's going, an ever retracting sort of sense of what constitutes racism, right?
Yeah.
It's getting smaller and smaller and more extreme, and then everyone else expands the good category here. Yeah.
Well, and then that spectacle. Then, if you've got white people with tiki torches saying,
anti-Semitic,
and other things I won't repeat here, that just gives you such an easy target. It's like a relief. It's almost like good white people need that to exist, because then you can point to it over there and say, see, that's where the bad stuff is. I mean, I know I'm not perfect, but we're at least okay.
Right.
And it really removes all kinds of examination of structural forms of racism and investments that white people have in all kinds of forms of.
This will be our last question, because I know you all have other fora to go to, and I want to give you travel time, as we call it at Brown.
Okay, I'll be real quick. I believe that I fit in the category that you're discussing of good white people. So I, 4 years ago, took a job teaching in Milwaukee, Wisconsin's worst zip code, the roots of the book Evicted. And I teach in an all-black school, and my comfort level, and we make a really strong effort to talk about race because we can't get African-American teachers. So we have primarily white teachers and all-black students. So we, as a school, have decided that it's more important to just talk about it and get really uncomfortable in order to build our, to get to a place where we're all comfortable. So I started my year teaching the first chapter of Ralph Ellison's The Battle Royale, and think about my discomfort. And you know what? And it really helped to talk about it, to say, I'm a white woman. You know what? These are all the privileges I have because I am white, and talk to me about it. And I have to say that I feel as though we're starting, that's been fairly effective. I just came back from Washington, D.C. because one of our former senators from Wisconsin financed a trip for our kids to go to the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. And what an eye-opening experience for our kids, who most of them have never left their zip code. So anyway, for what it's worth, I don't know. I mean, I just feel like it's really, really important to get uncomfortable.
I think you're right. Thank you. And, in some ways that loops back to the question you had earlier about, so what can white people do? And I want to be clear, white people dealing with their discomfort is not going to by itself produce racial justice. And it may be, let's be clear about that. I'm not claiming that. And I'm not even sure white people in the end are going to be able to do a whole lot to further racial justice. It's going to be people of color pushing and things like that. But are there ways white people can help? Are there ways that we can at least not get in the way as often as we do? So the first step in some ways is not to race to fix things, because that gets you right back into a place where you're comfortable. That desire to fix it, I think, is so much about just wanting to be comfortable again. And so, one of the first things you can do is start having these really uncomfortable conversations where you talk about whiteness with other white people. Yeah, and these are usually not fun.
They're about what?
They really, really aren't.
They're unfun, and they're like 2 minutes long.
And yeah, you'll be lucky if you get to have the conversation, and you will feel like you were sticking your foot in your mouth. And maybe in some ways, you just got to say, like, I don't even know what I'm doing here, but so I don't have a magic formula for how to do that. So you feel good doing it. You're not going to feel good. You're going and you're going to have reactions from neighbors or coworkers or family members where they're going to look at you like they're scared a little bit. It's like, what are you doing all of a sudden? Because you start talking openly about whiteness as a white person, that marks you as one of the bad white people. That you're, so secretly you're really one of them or something. So these are what I call existential risks that with relationships, with your own. So don't race to fix anything. You're going to have to learn how to live in some discomfort first, and that would be some of the soul work that I would call for as a first step.
Yeah, and not only is there a risk to be looking like the bad whites, there's also true worry about being a race traitor. Whites who work for racial justice take risks if they work for racial justice very intently at the nexus of where major racial privileges are occupying. So, I mean, this isn't just an ideological situation, it's a on-the-ground matter. But the other thing is that there are lots of great, just to add to your answer and to refer to your point, there are lots of, maybe not lots, but there are a number of really terrific scholars and speakers and activists who work on white anti-racist issues. You mentioned Robin DiAngelo, and we brought her here last year, and so her video is on our website, which I
there
told
you
you
could
about.
see.
On white
good.
fragility, it's just
Yeah.
fantastic. And once you see these categories, you start seeing them in everyday
Yeah.
life. I didn't have words for some of these categories, and I thought, oh, that's just a perfect description of what happens.
Yeah,
And
that
she unpacks
fragility.
how it happens. And so, and you know, you have other ideas we don't have time for here, but you know, this notion of, you know, white priority, which not privilege, which has sort of economic advantage categories, but how does whiteness, even in its, when it's being economically oppressed, has racial privileges or priorities attached
Yeah.
to it. Learning more categories, sort of, there's, you know, this is a brown community, so you know my goal here is more education, but it is true that the ideas help us see the world we're in much more effectively, and that's what this book did for me. So I just want to thank you so much for the book and for the
thank you.
conversation, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah,
I know
thank
it's time
you.
to go. Thank you.
Thank you as well.